The cold air of Glacier National Park had never felt so oppressive. It was July 15th, 2011, when Tyler and Emily Lawson, siblings from Portland, Oregon, embarked on what was supposed to be an ordinary camping trip in the heart of Montana's wilderness. The two were experienced hikers, having spent countless weekends traversing the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Emily, 24, and Tyler, 27, were inseparable. Their bond, forged through years of shared adventure, was unbreakable, or so it seemed. They set out with their gear, a tent, and enough supplies for a 5-day trek, aiming to scale a few peaks near Lake McDonald and explore the less trodden paths of Glacier National Park. Their last communication was brief, a message to their parents that they would be heading into the backcountry for a few days without signal. Nothing out of the ordinary. They were well prepared, well equipped, and well versed in the ways of the wilderness. There was no reason to believe anything would go wrong, but it did. The park rangers were alerted to the disappearance when Tyler and Emily failed to check in at the designated ranger station on the 19th. Initially, the authorities weren't overly concerned. People often misjudged the time required for backcountry hikes, and sometimes hikers simply extended their trips without notifying anyone. However, when the siblings' tent and gear didn't appear at their scheduled pickup location by the 21st, a full-scale search began. The National Park Service launched an immediate operation, enlisting search and rescue teams, helicopters, and experienced trackers. The wilderness was dense, rugged, and unforgiving, perfect terrain for someone to get lost, but Tyler and Emily knew it well. They were familiar with the layout of the park, and there were no obvious dangers, no threats of storms or avalanches. Despite that, the search yielded nothing. No footprints, no sign of struggle, and no clues to their whereabouts. Weeks turned into months, and still, the searchers came up empty. Their disappearance remained an enigma, one of many unexplained cases in the vast expanse of Glacier's wilderness. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, no unusual tracks from animals, and no indication that they had encountered any sort of external threat. The siblings simply vanished. By the end of 2011, the case was officially closed. No body, no clues, no evidence, just an unsettling gap in the history of one of America's most iconic national parks. For the Lawsons family, grief turned to despair as they had no closure, no answers to explain what had happened to their loved ones. But then, 10 years later, an unexpected discovery would reopen the case in a way no one could have ever predicted. In late September 2021, a group of hikers taking a route near the Hidden Lake area stumbled upon something that no one had expected to find. Among the trees, hidden deep in the forest near a mountain ridge, they discovered a fully intact tent. There were no visible signs of a struggle, and everything inside appeared undisturbed. The tent was still staked down securely to the ground, the zippers tightly closed as if it had never been moved since it was set up. When the hikers approached and began to inspect the site, they found something even more alarming: a pair of hiking boots near the tent's entrance, neatly placed side by side. There were no signs of anyone nearby, and the area seemed unusually pristine, unusually untouched by time. Most baffling of all, a single item inside the tent stood out: a journal, lying open, as if it had been left for someone to find. The hiker who first discovered it immediately recognized the significance of the situation. He had heard the stories of missing hikers in the park, the rumors that whispered about strange disappearances, but seeing it firsthand was unsettling. The hiker quickly alerted the authorities, who arrived to secure the scene. When investigators from the National Park Service examined the tent, they confirmed that it was indeed the same campsite Tyler and Emily had registered for 10 years earlier. The boots, the gear, the layout, all matched their descriptions. Yet even more haunting was the open journal. The pages were filled with entries from Emily, and the last few pages were particularly unsettling. July 18th, 2011. We're just about to finish our hike to the summit. The views are unbelievable. It's been hard, but we're both excited to reach the peak tomorrow. July 19th, 2011. Something feels off. Tyler says he's hearing things in the woods at night. I haven't heard anything, but he's been nervous. I'm sure it's just the isolation getting to him. July 20th, 2011. We lost track of time today. The weather is changing fast, and I think we missed our turn. Tyler says we should go back, but I don't want to. There's something up here that feels different. I can't explain it. The final entry, dated July 21st, was brief and cryptic. It's not safe here. We can't go back. There's something in the woods. The journal ended abruptly, with no further entries. The pages were covered in dirt and grime, as though they had been exposed to the elements for months, even years. But the tent itself, the campsite, was pristine, as if it had been untouched since the night of their last camp. The question remained: how had the tent, along with the journal, remained undisturbed for a decade? And where were Tyler and Emily? As the news of the discovery spread, theories ran wild. Some speculated that the tent had somehow remained hidden from the searchers, preserved in an area of the park that had been inaccessible or overlooked. Others believed that the siblings had become victims of some unknown supernatural force, possibly linked to the park's ancient, eerie history. Local legends whispered of strange forces at play in the deep wilderness, stories of disappearances tied to areas where time itself seemed to behave erratically, as if the park were alive and unwilling to release its secrets. But one thing was clear: there was more to this mystery than anyone had realized. The tent was a perfect snapshot in time, frozen in the moments before Tyler and Emily vanished without a trace. Yet their last written words suggested something far darker than anyone could have anticipated. Investigators were left with an unsettling possibility. Was the desert's vastness to blame, or was something else at play? The journal entries spoke of unease, of unexplained noises, and of a force they couldn't identify. Had the siblings stumbled upon something far more sinister, something the park had kept hidden for years? The Lawsons' family, still devastated by their loss, began to ask the questions that had been haunting them for a decade. What had happened to Tyler and Emily? Why had their tent been left standing, fully intact, as if they had simply stepped away? And what had they discovered, hidden in the wilderness, that had terrified them enough to leave behind their belongings and vanish forever? As the investigation deepened, more questions arose, but the answers remained elusive. What really happened that summer in Glacier National Park? What had the siblings encountered? And why had they been so intent on leaving behind a final, cryptic message? The mystery was far from over, and the tent, unscathed, untouched, held the key to unraveling the chilling truth. The tent stood in stark contrast to the rest of the wilderness. As Claire Donovan, the investigative journalist who had become increasingly drawn into the mystery, approached the site, a chill crept down her spine. She couldn't quite place it, but there was something undeniably unsettling about the pristine condition of the campsite. The journal, the very item that had led them here, was still open, its pages weathered, but intact. It didn't make sense. Everything about the tent, the positioning, the untouched state of the gear inside, felt wrong. It was as if it hadn't been touched in a decade, yet it stood as though waiting for its owners to return. The area around the tent was devoid of any recent footprints, yet the air was thick with a strange sense of time having stopped. No animals had ventured near it, no birds had nested in the trees surrounding it. The only sign of life was the wind, gently pushing the fabric of the tent as it flapped lightly against the dry earth. But beneath the surface, there was an energy, a stillness that made Claire's every instinct scream that she should turn back. The land felt oppressive, as if it had been waiting for someone to discover its secret. She knelt beside the journal, tracing her fingers along the dirt-streaked pages. The last entry she had read played in her mind. "It's not safe here. We can't go back. There's something in the woods." What had Emily and Tyler found in the forest? What had they seen or experienced that had led them to leave such an urgent warning and yet disappear without a trace? Claire felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing against her chest, but it wasn't just the journal's contents that disturbed her. It was the complete lack of any other sign of the siblings. If they had simply wandered off, why had they left everything behind? Why had the tent been left as though it were still in use, as though they had planned to return? She pulled out her notebook, jotting down her thoughts quickly before she could lose them. She had seen enough missing persons cases in her time as a journalist to recognize the patterns. People didn't just vanish without a trace, and people certainly didn't leave their belongings in such perfect order if they were planning to return. The fog, which had been lingering at the edges of the campsite, seemed to thicken as Claire stood up, her eyes scanning the canyon walls that rose high around her. The landscape had a way of drawing the eye, endless stretches of rock and trees, and yet she felt as though something unseen was watching her from the shadows. There was a disturbance in the air, a subtle hum, like a distant vibration that Claire couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the wind. It felt deeper, more primal. She paused, listening intently. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a constant low-frequency hum that seemed to reverberate through her chest. Her unease deepened. "Hey, Claire, you should come see this." A voice cut through her thoughts, and she turned to see one of the rangers, Jeff Parker, emerging from the trees, his eyes wide with something between disbelief and apprehension. He was holding a small object in his hand. "We found something else." Claire approached him quickly, her curiosity piqued. He handed her the item, a small, weathered piece of metal, smooth and round. At first glance, it looked like a keychain or a piece of scrap metal, but something about the wear on its surface made Claire's heart race. She flipped it over in her hand and saw an engraving. Her breath caught. It was a symbol, a shape, almost like an eye, a spiraling curve, etched into the metal in intricate, almost deliberate lines. She had seen this symbol before, but where? She couldn't remember. It was as if it had been locked away in her mind, just out of reach. "Where did you find this?" Claire asked, her voice tight. Jeff motioned toward a small ravine just beyond the tent site. "We were investigating some disturbed ground near the edge of the canyon. It was buried a few feet down, but not very deep, like someone had tried to hide it." Claire stood still for a moment, the weight of the discovery settling over her. The symbol had to mean something. It was no coincidence. She had to dig deeper. She followed Jeff to the ravine, her mind racing. As they reached the small depression in the earth, Claire's gaze fell on the rocks. Something wasn't right. The ground was not as it should be. There was an unnatural smoothness to it, a kind of disturbed layering, as though it had been shifted, reshaped. Claire crouched down, brushing the dirt away with her hands. Beneath the loose earth, something gleamed. Her pulse quickened. She dug faster, her fingers trembling as she uncovered what looked like an old rusted metal box, partially buried in the soil. It had a heavy, weathered appearance, as if it had been sitting there for decades. She pulled it free, the metal creaking in protest as it came loose. Jeff stepped closer, his breath audible. "What is that?" "I don't know," Claire muttered, her hands trembling as she tried to open it. It was locked, but there was no visible lock, just a clasp that seemed stuck. With a bit of effort, she pried it open, her heart pounding in anticipation. The inside was empty, but there, at the bottom, was something else, a small, folded piece of paper. She took it carefully, unfolding it with the gentleness of handling something fragile. It was a map. The ink was faded, but it was still legible. The map seemed to show part of Glacier National Park, but there was a section marked with an X, a spot deep within the park, hidden from any established trails, and underneath, scrawled in hurried handwriting, was a note. "The eye is real. They found it. We shouldn't have come here. Get out." Claire's stomach twisted as she read the words again. The Eye. It was the same symbol from the metal token, the same sense of dread and foreboding that had filled the journal entries. Rachel and Tyler had uncovered something hidden deep in the park. But what was it? And what had happened to them once they found it? She looked up at Jeff, her voice barely a whisper. We need to go to this place. Now. But as they turned to leave, the wind picked up again, howling through the trees, and Claire heard it once more. A distant hum, faint and distant, yet unmistakable. She didn't need to see it to know that it was the desert itself, alive and pulling them deeper. They had found something, but the worst was still to come. The desert didn't want them to know its secrets. It didn't want them to understand what had happened to Tyler and Emily. And now, it didn't want Claire to leave. The search for the truth was far from over. The desert had begun to reveal its answers. But Claire had the terrible feeling that some answers weren't meant to be known. Some truths were better left buried, lost in the endless expanse of the wilderness. And yet, she was already too deep. There was no turning back now. The days that followed the discovery of the metal box and the cryptic map felt strangely suspended in time. The air was thick with anticipation and dread, and Claire couldn't shake the feeling that the desert had awakened something within her, something deep and ancient. The map they had found, marked with the symbol of the eye and the chilling words. The eye is real. They found it. We shouldn't have come here. Get out. It seemed to pull her deeper into the mystery. It was as though the desert had whispered its secrets to Rachel and Tyler before they vanished. And now, Claire was hearing that same whisper, beckoning her toward an inevitable truth. But there was no turning back. The next morning, Claire stood at the edge of the ravine, her eyes scanning the horizon, trying to make sense of the map they had found. It was clear that the area marked with the X was deep within the park, far from any of the well-established trails. The more she thought about it, the more unsettling the whole situation became. Rachel and Tyler hadn't just gotten lost. No, the desert had claimed them, drawn them in, perhaps because they had uncovered something they weren't supposed to find. "Ready?" Jeff Parker asked, his voice a little too calm. The park ranger had been with Claire since the first day she arrived, and though he had his own reservations about the search, he was now fully committed. His presence was a strange comfort, but even his steady demeanor couldn't hide the tension in his posture. "Not sure," Claire admitted, glancing at the map again. "But I don't think we have a choice." She was right. There was no escaping this now. They had found something that couldn't be ignored. If Tyler and Emily had uncovered the eye, it was their responsibility to understand what had happened, and perhaps to stop whatever force had taken them. Together, they hiked deeper into the park, the trail growing more rugged as they left behind the familiar routes. The forest around them felt oppressive, the trees dense and twisted, as though they were closing in around them. The air grew heavier. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in thin, uneven strips, casting eerie shadows on the ground. It felt as though they were being watched, though no one was there. Claire kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see something, or someone, lurking in the fog behind them. She tried to shake off the feeling, but it stuck with her. Something wasn't right in the woods. The further they trekked, the more the world around them seemed to blur. The sounds of birds and wind had faded into silence. Even the distant hum of traffic from the nearby highway had disappeared, replaced by an eerie quiet. It was as if the park itself had been cut off from the rest of the world, a place frozen in time, cut off from everything that existed beyond it. By midday, they arrived at the base of the canyon, where the map indicated the marked location. It was an overgrown area, the path barely visible under the thick brush. A sense of foreboding filled the air. Claire couldn't help but feel that they were walking into something they weren't meant to understand. The land felt different here, ancient and untamed. The rocks seemed to pulse with some strange energy, like they were alive, breathing in time with the hum Claire had heard before. "This is it," Jeff said quietly, glancing at Claire. He too could feel the weight of the place. "Are you sure you want to go any further?" Claire didn't answer immediately. She stood there for a moment, her mind racing, torn between the urge to turn back and the need to find the truth. Rachel and Tyler had been drawn into this place. They had been lured here by something they hadn't understood. The fear she felt now was the same fear they must have felt before they vanished. "No," Claire said, her voice steady. "We can't stop now." The entrance to the hidden part of the canyon was narrow and dark, almost as if the land had purposely obscured it from view. Claire stepped forward, brushing away the thick undergrowth, and peered into the darkness. The walls of the canyon loomed high, the rock slick and foreboding. There was something unsettling about it, something that made her hesitate. "Stay close," Claire warned Jeff. She could barely make out the path ahead, the light dimming as the canyon walls grew closer together. They moved forward, the air thick with silence. The only sounds were their footsteps on the gravel and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, and Claire could feel the weight of something intangible pressing on her chest. There was something here, something that wanted to stay hidden. And then they found it. In the center of a small clearing surrounded by rocks was a rock formation unlike any Claire had ever seen. It was as if the earth had twisted itself into a massive, jagged symbol, its edges sharp and unnatural. Claire's breath caught in her throat. This was it. This was what Rachel and Tyler had found. The eye, the force that had drawn them in. The symbol on the rock was like nothing she had ever seen before, circular, with lines radiating outward, forming a spiral. The shape seemed to pulse with energy, and the closer Claire got, the more she felt it, an overwhelming magnetic pull. It wasn't just the shape of the rock, it was the land itself, alive with something dark, something that had been waiting for anyone foolish enough to discover it. Claire and Jeff stood in front of the symbol, the silence almost unbearable. The air was thick, and it felt like the earth beneath them was alive, as though it were breathing, shifting with unseen force. "You feel that?" Jeff's voice trembled slightly as he spoke. Claire nodded, her gaze fixed on the rock. "It's like something's here, in the land." She reached forward, her fingers brushing the cold stone, and a jolt of energy shot through her body. It was like being struck by lightning, intense, overwhelming. For a moment, everything went black. When Claire opened her eyes again, she wasn't sure how much time had passed. The air had grown even heavier, the wind still, and the world around her felt distorted, as if the very fabric of reality had bent. She could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, the pulse of the earth beneath her feet reverberating through her body. "Claire?" Jeff's voice was strained. "Are you okay?" She looked around, disoriented, as if she had stepped into another world. The ground beneath her felt unstable, and the rock symbol seemed to shimmer, fading in and out of existence. I don't know what this is," Claire whispered, her voice distant. She took a step back, the pull of the symbol still strong, still tugging at her. And in that moment, she realized the truth. Whatever Rachel and Tyler had discovered, whatever force had drawn them into the desert, was far more powerful than she could have ever imagined. This was the eye, and it wasn't done with her. Not yet. The air around Claire grew heavier, thick with an almost suffocating tension as she stood before the rock formation. The symbol, carved into the earth, pulsed with an unnatural energy that seemed to warp the very fabric of the land. It wasn't just a marking. It was alive in some inexplicable way, as if it had always been here, waiting for someone to find it, someone to step into its power. The weight of that presence pressed against her chest, and for a moment she wondered if she had made a grave mistake. Jeff stood beside her, his expression tense. He wasn't speaking, but Claire could feel the same sense of unease radiating off of him. They had come so far, uncovered so many clues, but now, standing here, facing the eye, it was as though they had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The silence in the canyon felt absolute, a stillness that was unnatural, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make the next move. The wind had stopped completely, and the world seemed suspended in a strange, eerie calm. Claire could hear nothing but the pounding of her own heart, her breath shallow as she took in the enormity of what they had stumbled upon. The symbol before her was not merely a pattern. It was a doorway, a threshold between the known and the unknown, a connection to something far older, far darker than she had ever imagined. Something ancient, something buried beneath the desert sands for centuries. She took a cautious step forward, her fingers barely grazing the surface of the stone. The sensation that shot through her was immediate and overwhelming. It was a wave of energy unlike anything she had ever felt, a raw, electric force that seemed to course through her veins, igniting every nerve in her body. She jerked her hand away, her breath catching in her throat. "Claire?" Jeff's voice cracked, filled with concern as he reached out to steady her, but Claire didn't hear him. She was focused on the symbol, the way it seemed to call to her, urging her to look closer, to understand. It wasn't just the desert she had uncovered. It was something much more. For the first time since arriving at Glacier National Park, Claire realized how small she was in the grand scheme of things. The desert, the land, the eye, it was all part of a system beyond her comprehension. Rachel and Tyler had been drawn here for a reason. They had found this, and it had taken them, just as it had taken countless others before them. "What did they find?" she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the thudding of her heartbeat. What were they trying to tell us? As she stood there, staring at the symbol, a memory resurfaced, one she hadn't thought of in years. It was something her grandmother had told her, something about the land, about ancient forces that lay hidden in places like this. It had always sounded like a myth, a warning told in hushed tones to children, something to keep them from wandering too far into the wilds. But now, standing here, Claire knew the truth. The stories weren't just stories. They were real. She had been pulled here by something much larger than herself, something that had been waiting for her. Just like Rachel, she had been called into this place. She was part of the pattern, part of the cycle of the eye. "What do we do now?" Jeff's voice broke through her reverie, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. Claire looked up, her mind swimming with the weight of the discovery. She didn't know what to say. The rational part of her, the investigative journalist, wanted to find an explanation, to dig into the science of it, to make sense of it all. But there was no making sense of this. The desert had its own rules, its own truth, and Claire was just beginning to understand how little control they had over it. "We keep moving forward," Claire said, her voice firm. She wasn't sure where that confidence came from, but it felt necessary. The truth had revealed itself in ways she hadn't expected, and now there was no turning back. "We keep following the trail. Rachel and Tyler came here for a reason. They uncovered something. We need to finish what they started." Jeff nodded, though the wariness in his eyes was clear. He had seen the same things Claire had, the way the desert seemed to stretch on forever, the strange energy that hummed beneath the surface. But he had been trained to trust facts, evidence, and procedure. What they were facing now was beyond any protocol or standard investigation. The desert didn't play by any rules. They continued forward, moving deeper into the canyon, the symbol still haunting Claire's mind. Every step she took felt like she was walking further into the unknown, deeper into a truth that was buried in the land. The air seemed thicker now, the silence more oppressive, as if the land was pressing against them, trying to swallow them whole. As they ventured on, Claire couldn't help but feel the oppressive weight of the desert around them. The rocks and cliffs felt like they were watching, waiting for them to uncover whatever it was the eye had hidden. The canyon walls seemed to close in, and Claire's footsteps grew heavier with each passing moment. It wasn't just the weight of the land, it was the weight of the unknown, the fear that they were about to uncover something that should remain buried. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a small clearing, the rocks around them rising higher and higher, casting deep shadows on the ground. The temperature had dropped significantly, and the air was now crisp and cold. At the center of the clearing was something that made Claire stop dead in her tracks: a stone altar. It was carved directly into the rock, its surface smooth and unnaturally pristine, as though it had been untouched by time. The strange symbol, the eye, was etched deeply into the altar's surface, and surrounding it were smaller carvings, symbols Claire couldn't immediately identify. The air around it felt charged, almost electric, and Claire could hear the faint hum again, like a heartbeat coming from deep within the earth. "What is this?" Jeff's voice was barely a whisper, as though he feared speaking too loudly would disturb whatever force lay hidden here. "I don't know," Claire said, though she felt the answer deep in her gut. She felt it in the air, in the ground beneath her feet. The desert had been waiting for them to find this, for them to come this far, and now it had them. She stepped closer to the altar, the hum growing louder with each movement. Her breath quickened, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the pull again, the same force that had drawn Rachel and Tyler, the same force that had marked them, that had lured them deeper into the desert. The desert didn't want them to leave. It didn't want them to uncover its secrets. And as Claire stood before the altar, staring into the swirling symbol of the eye, she realized the truth. They weren't supposed to find this, but they had, and now the desert was claiming them too. As Claire reached out to touch the altar, her fingers brushing the cold stone, the world seemed to shift. The desert around her seemed to tremble, the ground vibrating beneath her. The hum rose to a deafening pitch, and Claire knew, with terrifying clarity, that the desert's grip was tightening. The eye was watching. The desert was alive, and it was never going to let them go. Claire's hand trembled as it hovered above the altar, the hum from the stone now vibrating through her entire body. It was as though the desert itself had reached out and wrapped around her, pulling her deeper into its ancient grasp. The symbol, the eye, carved into the altar seemed to pulse with an energy that was alive, and Claire couldn't help but feel that by touching it, she was crossing a threshold, one that couldn't be undone. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she took a step closer, her fingers finally making contact with the cool, smooth surface of the rock. The moment her skin touched the stone, the ground beneath her feet seemed to shudder, and an overwhelming wave of energy surged through her. She gasped, her body freezing in place as the world around her shifted. The canyon walls seemed to tilt, as though the earth itself was turning on its axis. The stars above flickered, their light dimming and then flaring up again, and the hum, the low, almost imperceptible hum, grew louder, filling her entire consciousness. It was as if she could hear the heartbeat of the desert itself, its rhythm pulsing through the very core of the earth. Claire closed her eyes, but the image of the symbol, the eye, was burned into her mind. It was as though the desert was speaking to her, not in words, but in images, emotions, and sensations. She saw flashes, quick, fleeting glimpses, of the land before her, of the time before people walked it. She saw shadows moving across the canyon walls, shapes in the mist that weren't quite human. And in those shadows, she saw faces, faces of people who had come here before her, people who had vanished, just like Rachel and Tyler. The realization struck her with brutal clarity. The desert didn't just take people, it claimed them. It absorbed them into its endless cycle, trapping them in its web, erasing them from time, from reality itself. The land wasn't a place to explore. It was a force, ancient and hungry, and those who sought to understand it were doomed to become a part of its eternal story. This is what happened to Rachel and Tyler, Claire thought, her chest tightening with fear. They hadn't just gotten lost. They hadn't just wandered off the trail. They had discovered this force, the Eye, and they had been consumed by it, just like she was now. There was no escape. Once you crossed the threshold, once you touched the altar, you became part of the desert. Her fingers tingled against the stone, and she pulled her hand away in shock. The hum had stopped, but the weight of the desert's presence remained, pressing in on her from all sides. She felt like she was drowning in the silence, the stillness, the suffocating knowledge that the land was alive, that it had claimed her in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Claire, Jeff's voice broke through the tension, sounding distant, distorted, as though he were speaking from far away. Claire, are you okay? She turned to him, her body still frozen in place. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. He hadn't touched the altar, hadn't felt what she had felt, but he could see it in her expression. She was no longer the same. The desert had changed her. I don't know, Claire stammered, her voice weak. I felt it. The desert, it's alive. It's not just the land, it's something more, something older. Jeff looked at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. What are you talking about? What's happening? Claire took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She wanted to explain, to tell him everything, the way the desert felt, the way it had called to her, to Rachel and Tyler, to everyone who had come too close. But the words wouldn't come. How could she explain something so impossible, so alien? The truth was too vast, too incomprehensible to put into words. We need to go, Claire finally said, her voice steadying as the reality of what had just happened settled in. Now. Jeff hesitated for a moment, his eyes darting to the altar and back to Claire. He didn't argue. He could feel it too, the palpable, oppressive weight of the desert, the sense that they were being watched, trapped in a space between realities. The hum in the air, the pull of the eye, was too much for him to ignore. They turned to leave the clearing, but as Claire moved toward the canyon's edge, the ground beneath them shifted again. The rumbling that had been faint before became stronger, more pronounced, reverberating through the rocks. The desert was reacting, moving in ways Claire couldn't understand, like it was alive, like it was aware of their every step. Claire's heart raced as she quickened her pace. We need to get out of here, now. This place, it's not just land, it's something else. Jeff was close behind, but Claire could feel his hesitation, the doubt in his steps. He hadn't felt what she had felt at the altar. He hadn't experienced the desert's full force. To him, this was just another strange, unexplained phenomenon, a disappearance, a mystery. But Claire knew better. She knew that what they had uncovered was not something that could be explained by logic or science. It was beyond that. It was a force that existed outside of human understanding, a force that had existed long before they arrived, and would continue to claim others long after they were gone. As they reached the edge of the clearing, Claire's eyes scanned the rocky landscape. The canyon stretched out before them, but something was wrong. The trail that had led them here, the path that should have been visible, was gone. The rocks seemed to have shifted, the terrain altered, as though the desert itself had erased the way forward. We can't leave, Claire whispered, her voice tight with dread. The desert doesn't want us to leave. Jeff stopped in his tracks, turning to her with a look of disbelief. What are you talking about? The words felt like they were coming from somewhere deep inside her, somewhere primal, a realization that had been building since she touched the altar. We've crossed into something else, Jeff, something we weren't meant to understand. We can't leave. Not now. She turned back to the altar, feeling the pull of it, the pull of the desert, urging her to return, to complete the cycle. And though every part of her screamed to resist, Claire knew, deep down, that she couldn't. The desert had claimed her, just as it had claimed Rachel and Tyler and countless others before them. There was no escaping it. The land, the eye, it had taken hold, and now it would never let go. The air around Claire felt like it was thickening, pushing down on her with a weight that was almost unbearable. She could feel it in her chest, the pull of the land, the ancient power that had claimed so many before her. The desert had always been more than just a stretch of sand and rock. It was alive, breathing, and it had chosen her. It had chosen Rachel and Tyler. And now, as the ground beneath her feet trembled again, Claire knew it wasn't over. The desert had waited long enough. "We need to go. We need to find a way out." Jeff's voice was tense, his eyes wide with a growing fear that mirrored Claire's own. She could see that he was struggling to understand, to process what was happening, but there was no time for that now. The desert wasn't interested in their questions or doubts. It was far older, far more powerful than their limited understanding could grasp. Claire didn't speak, she simply nodded, her body moving on its own, urging her to leave the clearing, to run. But as she tried to step forward, the earth beneath her seemed to shift, and she stumbled, her feet slipping in the loose gravel. It felt as though the land itself had become a trap, pulling at her, urging her to stay. The humming sound was back, louder now, filling her ears, vibrating through her entire body. She stood still, the weight of the land pressing down on her, and she felt it. Something had changed. The desert had reacted to them, to their intrusion. The air felt charged, as if something was waiting, something ancient and powerful, ready to make its presence known. She turned to Jeff, her voice shaking. "The desert, it's not just a place, Jeff. It's alive." Jeff looked at her, his face pale. "Alive? Claire, I don't understand. What do you mean?" She shook her head, feeling the fear creeping up her spine, the dread of being so close to the source of all this power, the truth that had been hidden for centuries. "I don't know how to explain it. It's not just the land. It's something else. Something pulling us in." The rumbling beneath them grew louder. Claire could feel it in the pit of her stomach now, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. It wasn't natural. It wasn't just the wind or the shifting of the landscape. It was as though the desert itself was alive, conscious, and it was angry. "We have to leave," Claire repeated, her voice strained as she tried to turn around, but the path they had taken just moments ago had vanished. It was as if the earth had swallowed it whole, leaving only jagged rocks and a vast expanse of emptiness. The canyon had changed. The trail, the exit, gone. "This isn't possible," Jeff whispered, his voice shaking. "This place doesn't make sense." But Claire knew better now. She could feel it. The desert had swallowed the path, trapping them in its grip. They were no longer part of the world they had once known. They were part of something else now. She looked at Jeff, her eyes wide, her voice tight with panic. "It's not letting us leave. We're trapped." The fog had returned, thick and suffocating, curling around the canyon walls and slowly moving in toward them. Claire could barely see past the mist, the air heavy with a strange pressure that made it difficult to breathe. The wind had picked up again, but it was different this time. It was no longer just wind. It felt like it was carrying whispers, faint and unintelligible, but they seemed to come from everywhere, wrapping around her like a cloak. "Claire," Jeff started, but his voice faltered as he looked around. "Do you hear that? The voices?" She nodded, feeling the hairs on the back of her neck rise. It wasn't just the wind, it was something else. The desert was alive with sound, voices, whispers, and a low, droning hum that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. It was as if the land itself was trying to communicate with them, to pull them deeper into its grasp. She turned again, facing the altar once more. It stood there, silent and imposing, the symbol carved into the stone still glowing faintly in the dim light. The hum grew louder, almost deafening now, and Claire felt her mind begin to unravel. The force of it was too much, too overwhelming. And then it stopped. The hum, the whispers, the pressure, everything went silent, as if the desert itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Claire's heartbeat was the only sound she could hear now, thundering in her ears, drowning out everything else. It's waiting, she thought. It's waiting for us to make a choice. The desert was not just a place, it was a force, a power older than any of them could understand. It had waited for Rachel and Tyler. It had waited for Claire. And now it was waiting for Jeff. It was waiting for them all to make the final decision, to embrace the desert's pull, to accept its mark, or to resist, to fight against something so ancient and powerful that resistance seemed impossible. Jeff stepped back, his face pale, his hands trembling. I can't stay here, he said, his voice breaking. I don't know what's happening, but I need to leave. Now. But Claire knew. The desert wouldn't let them leave. It had drawn them in, just as it had drawn Rachel and Tyler, and now it was pulling them into its depths. There was no escape. Not for them. Not for anyone who came too close. No, Claire whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. We can't leave. It's already too late. The wind howled, and the ground trembled once again. The fog closed in tighter around them, and Claire could feel it. The desert was closing in, tightening its grip. She turned toward Jeff, her eyes wide with the realization. This place doesn't just take your body. It takes your soul, your essence. Once you come here, once you touch the land, you're part of it. Forever. Jeff's eyes were wide with fear, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No, we can't let it take us. We have to fight it. Claire took a step closer to him, grabbing his arm. She could feel the pull of the desert, the weight of it on her chest. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening, but Claire stood firm. We can't fight it, Jeff. We can only understand it. We can only accept that we've been chosen. Chosen? Jeff's voice cracked, the word bitter in his mouth. Chosen for what? For this, Claire said, her voice breaking as she gestured to the land around them. For the desert, for the eye. The ground beneath them began to shake violently. Claire stumbled, but she didn't fall. The desert was pulling at them, urging them to step forward, to embrace its power. Jeff looked at her one last time, fear in his eyes, and then, with a final desperate breath, he turned and ran. But as he did, Claire knew. There was no escaping the desert. The eye had claimed them both, and there was no turning back. The whispers grew louder, the hum of the desert vibrating through Claire's chest. The land had claimed them, just as it had claimed Rachel, just as it had claimed countless others, and it would never let them go. Not now. Not ever. The desert had won, and Claire understood. The cycle would never end. It would always be waiting. The desert, vast and unyielding, had claimed its prize. Claire stood motionless, her body frozen in place, the weight of the desert pressing down on her like an invisible hand. The wind howled again, but this time it felt like more than just wind. It was the land itself, alive, breathing, waiting. She had crossed the threshold, just as Rachel and Tyler had, just as the others before them had. The desert had drawn them in, and now it would never let them leave. Claire's mind raced, trying to process everything that had happened, everything that had led her here. She had come seeking answers, following the trail left by Rachel and Tyler, hoping to understand what had taken them. But now she realized that the answers weren't meant to be understood. The desert wasn't something that could be explained by reason or logic. It was something older, something far more powerful than anything she had ever encountered. The fog around her thickened again, swirling like a living entity, and the hum in the air grew louder, vibrating through her very bones. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as though the desert itself was alive, moving, shifting. She could feel the pressure building, the air growing heavier, as though the land was waiting for something, waiting for her to give in. But Claire wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. She had seen too much, uncovered too much to let it all go without a fight. She had come too far to be consumed by the desert, to let it claim her like it had claimed Rachel, Tyler, and so many others before them. She wouldn't let the desert win. But as she stood there, struggling to breathe under the oppressive weight of the land, she heard it again, the whispering voices, faint but unmistakable. They were everywhere, swirling around her, like the wind itself was speaking to her. You are part of it now. The voice was low, almost soothing, as though it were trying to lull her into submission. The desert had marked her, just as it had marked those who had come before her. It had taken Rachel and Tyler. It had taken them all. And now, it was her turn. She could feel the pull, the force drawing her closer to the symbol, to the altar, to the eye. But Claire resisted. She stepped back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She couldn't let it take her. She wouldn't let it erase her. "Jeff!" she shouted, her voice echoing in the stillness of the canyon. There was no response, no sign of him. She didn't know where he had gone, whether he had run, or whether the desert had claimed him too. But she couldn't afford to worry about him now. She had to focus on herself, on finding a way out. She turned, her eyes scanning the canyon, looking for any sign of a path, any sign of hope. But the desert had a way of hiding its answers. The path was gone, swallowed up by the land, the earth shifting and changing in ways that defied logic. "You can't escape," the voice whispered again. "You belong to the desert now. You belong to the eye." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to breathe. The pressure was unbearable now. The land was closing in around her, its energy so thick that she could barely move. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She could feel the desert reaching out, pulling her in. But then something changed. The humming, the whispering, the weight pressing on her chest, it all stopped. Suddenly, the air was still, the silence almost deafening. Claire froze, her senses on high alert, unsure of what was happening. For a moment, the desert seemed to hold its breath, as though it were waiting for her to make the next move. And then the ground trembled once again. This time, it was different. The tremor was deep, coming from beneath her feet, as though the very earth was shifting, rearranging itself. She stumbled, trying to maintain her balance, but the ground was unstable now, shifting beneath her with every step she took. The fog was swirling faster, the wind picking up again, but this time it felt like a warning. "It's time," the voice whispered. "You're not meant to leave. You're part of the land now." The realization hit Claire like a physical blow. She had known deep down that there was no escaping the desert. But the truth was more horrifying than she could have imagined. The desert didn't just take its victims, it absorbed them. It consumed them, erasing them from time, from memory, from everything. Rachel and Tyler hadn't just disappeared, they had been erased. And Claire, no matter how hard she tried to fight it, was now part of that cycle. She could feel it now, deep within her, the pull of the land, the power of the eye. The desert was not just a place, it was a living, breathing force. And once you crossed into its grasp, there was no going back. You became part of it. Forever. "No," Claire thought, her fists clenched. "I won't let it take me. Not like this." But the desert had already claimed her. It had already marked her. The only thing left now was to accept it. The desert was waiting, and there was no escaping its grasp. The land had claimed Rachel and Tyler, and now it had claimed Claire. She could feel it deep inside her, the weight of it settling into her very soul. She looked around one last time, her eyes scanning the canyon, the rocks, the earth. She could see it now, the patterns in the land, the way it had been shaped, the way it had drawn her in. The desert was not just a place, it was a force, ancient and powerful, and it had been waiting for her. Claire took a deep breath, her mind finally understanding the truth. The desert had claimed them all, it had drawn them in, absorbed them, and now it was her turn. But as she stood there, accepting her fate, something shifted. A break in the fog, a glimpse of light. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The desert had claimed her, but she had not been swallowed. Not yet. There was still something left, something Claire could hold on to. The truth. And with that realization, Claire took one final step forward, her body and mind surrendering to the desert. The eye had drawn her in, and now she would become part of its eternal story. She would never leave, but maybe, just maybe, she could become something more than just a memory. The ground trembled once again beneath Claire's feet, the vibration pulsing through her bones. It was no longer just an unsettling hum, it was a force. The desert was moving, shifting, alive in a way she couldn't understand. The fog began to swirl more rapidly, and the wind howled like a living creature, echoing through the canyon. Claire stood still, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on her, and in that moment she knew the desert was doing something to her. It was changing her. For a long moment, nothing moved. The world around her felt suspended in time. The air was thick with energy, thick with the undeniable presence of the eye. It had watched, it had waited, and now it had claimed her. The weight in the air was suffocating, but Claire's heart had slowed, her breathing steadying. It was like her body had accepted the inevitable. But then, through the fog, Claire saw something she couldn't have prepared for. Movement. At first, it was a blur, a shadow against the fog, shifting and undulating. But then it became clearer. A figure, a person standing on the edge of the canyon. The silhouette was tall and faint, almost indistinguishable from the mist. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She blinked, hoping it was a trick of the light or the fog, but it didn't fade. It stood there, solid and unmoving, watching her. Her breath hitched. Her thoughts raced back to the symbols Rachel and Tyler had uncovered, the stories they had written about something watching them. Had the desert, in its ancient and twisted power, brought them back? Were they here now, as shadows, trapped in the land? Or was this another part of the desert's force, another manifestation of the eye? "Rachel," Claire whispered, not knowing why she said it. The figure didn't respond, but Claire felt the pull, as if it were drawing her toward it, beckoning her to take a step closer. "No," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head. This wasn't Rachel. Rachel had been consumed by the desert, like so many others. Claire had seen the symbol, felt the energy. She understood it now. The desert didn't bring people back. It didn't give second chances. But there it stood, waiting. For a moment, Claire felt a deep, gnawing fear, like she was standing on the edge of something far darker than she had realized. The figure seemed to be calling her, urging her to come closer, and for a second she felt her feet begin to move without her conscious decision. The desert had claimed her, yes, but it had also left her with something, a choice. She couldn't explain it, but something inside her snapped. She was done being a part of this cycle. She was done being a pawn in the desert's eternal game. "Not this time," Claire said aloud, her voice clear, resolute. And with that she turned her back on the figure, the fog, the desert. She would not let herself be consumed. She wouldn't let the desert claim her entirely, not if she could still make a choice. As she moved away, the desert seemed to fight back. The earth beneath her feet shifted, and the wind howled, but Claire pushed on. The path she had taken before, where the landscape seemed to shift and twist into impossible shapes, was now nothing but a blur, a maze with no clear end. Yet Claire kept moving, faster now, her feet pounding the earth. But as she reached the edge of the canyon, the wind stopped abruptly, the fog parted, and for the first time since she had entered the desert, she saw the sun. The light was soft, pale, casting long shadows over the rocks. For a moment, Claire thought it was a dream. The warmth of the sun on her skin felt foreign after so many days in the cold, oppressive fog. She turned back to look one last time at the canyon, at the place where Rachel and Tyler had vanished. The figure was gone. The hum, the whispers, the pull, it had all stopped. It was as though the desert had released its grip, letting her go, finally letting her escape. She didn't know why, but she was free. She was no longer bound to the land, no longer part of its cycle. But as Claire stood at the canyon's edge, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of loss. The desert had taken so much, but it had given her something too, something she couldn't quite put into words. Maybe it was the understanding of the desert, of the eye, of the land's power, or maybe it was the knowledge that she had survived. She had come this far, uncovered so many secrets, and yet the truth still felt so incomplete. What had happened to Rachel and Tyler? What had they truly discovered here, in the heart of the wilderness? She would never know for sure. And that was the desert's greatest power. It didn't give answers. It gave questions, eternal questions, questions that would never be fully understood. Claire had survived, but she knew the desert would never leave her. Not truly. It was a part of her now, just as it had been a part of Rachel and Tyler, and all those who had been lost in its depths. Claire's breath slowed as she stepped forward, leaving the canyon behind her. She could still feel the desert's presence, lingering, watching. But she was free for now, and that, she realized, was all she could ask for. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the desert stretched out before her, vast and empty, yet alive with something deeper, something darker. And somewhere, deep within its heart, the eye watched. It always watched. But Claire was free. For now. Claire continued walking, the silence of the desert wrapping around her like a heavy cloak. The sun had disappeared completely now, leaving the sky tinged with deep hues of purple and orange as the last traces of daylight faded. The landscape ahead was vast and unchanging, a wilderness that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. She had made it out of the canyon, out of the place where the desert had held her captive. But the feeling of being watched, of being followed, remained. The desert had marked her, just as it had marked Rachel and Tyler, and no matter how far she walked, she knew it would never truly let her go. The wind picked up, swirling around her, carrying with it the scent of dust and earth. The familiar whispers that had haunted her for days were gone, but their absence left a hollow space inside her, a gnawing emptiness that she couldn't shake. She could still feel the desert's pull, like a tether between her and the land. It wasn't physical, it was deeper than that, a connection that couldn't be explained, a force that had woven itself into her very being. She thought of Rachel and Tyler, of the messages they had left behind, the journal, the cryptic words, the strange symbol of the eye. She thought of the desert's power, the way it had drawn them in, consumed them, left nothing behind but memories, whispers, and a tangled web of unanswered questions. She didn't have the answers, not for Rachel, not for herself, not for anyone who had come to the desert seeking the truth and been lost to it. The moon had risen now, casting a pale light across the rocky terrain. Claire paused for a moment, taking in the stillness around her. The desert was peaceful at night, deceptively so. It was a calm that masked something darker, something that waited just beneath the surface. Claire had learned that much. The desert didn't forget, it didn't forgive, and it didn't let go. She reached into her backpack, her hand shaking slightly, and pulled out the map they had found, the map that had led them to the altar, to the symbol, to the eye. It was weathered, torn in places, but the markings were still visible. The X that had marked the spot where Rachel and Tyler had disappeared. The path they had taken, and the place they had found. It was all here, etched into the fragile paper, as if to say that this place, this power, would never be forgotten. Claire stared at the map for a long time, her mind racing. She had uncovered the secrets of the desert, seen the forces at play, but there was so much more she didn't understand. The map was a key, a clue, but it was incomplete. The symbol of the eye, the warnings in the journal, everything pointed to something greater, something hidden in the land, something that had drawn Rachel, Tyler, and others before them into its grip. But what was it? What did it want? Claire closed her eyes, the weight of the questions pressing on her chest. The desert had claimed them, had marked them, and it would never let them go. Not completely. She knew now that the desert's power was not something that could be outrun. It was not something that could be reasoned with. It was ancient, primal, and it had its own rules, its own rhythms. The eye was just one part of it, a force that had been waiting long before anyone had set foot on this land. And no matter how many people came, no matter how many were drawn into its grasp, the desert would always remain. Claire opened her eyes, staring at the vast expanse before her. There was no sign of the trail they had come from, no sign of civilization anywhere in sight. She was alone now, truly alone, in the heart of a wilderness that had swallowed so many. The desert stretched out, empty and silent, but Claire knew it wasn't empty. It was alive, watching, waiting. It had taken so much, and it would take more. It was a cycle, an endless cycle, one that couldn't be broken. And yet, Claire couldn't bring herself to regret what she had learned. She had uncovered the truth, or at least part of it. She understood the desert now, in a way that few ever would. It wasn't just a place. It was a force, a living entity, and it would always be a part of her, just as it had been a part of Rachel and Tyler. There was no escaping it, no breaking free. But Claire had survived. She had walked away, though she wasn't sure if she would ever truly be free. The desert had taken its toll, had marked her, but she had left with something. The knowledge that the eye was real, that the land had a power beyond understanding. It wasn't something that could be explained away or ignored. It was there, in the earth, in the air, in the very essence of the desert itself. The moon was high now, casting its light across the land. Claire stood for a long time, staring out into the desert, knowing that this was just the beginning. The desert would always be with her, but it wasn't just a place she had left behind. It had become part of her story, and she would carry it with her always. With a final glance at the vast, endless horizon, Claire turned and began to walk. The path ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure: the desert would always be watching. It always had been. The desert stretched out before Claire, vast and endless, an ocean of sand and stone that seemed to pulse with life beneath her feet. Each step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the land itself was aware of her presence, watching her every move. It had been days since she had left the heart of the canyon, since she had uncovered the ancient force that had claimed Rachel, Tyler, and so many others. The weight of it, of what she had learned, had settled in her bones, and no matter how far she walked, she knew the desert would always be with her. It had marked her, and there was no escaping it. The wind had picked up again, howling through the canyons, carrying the faintest whispers of voices in the air. Claire could hear them now, faint and distant, like echoes from another time. She had heard these whispers before, in the fog, in the canyon, but now they seemed clearer, as though they were calling her. She could feel the pulse of the desert in her chest, The same hum she had felt when she touched the altar, when she had stood before the symbol of the eye. The desert was alive, and it was watching. She had thought she could leave, that she could outrun it. But as the days passed and the landscape shifted around her, Claire knew she had never truly escaped. She was part of the desert now. She could feel it deep within her, in her thoughts, in her very soul. The desert didn't just claim the body, it claimed the mind, the spirit, and once it had taken you, it never let go. Claire had survived the desert, but survival had a cost. The truth she had uncovered had not set her free. It had bound her to the land, to the force that had been waiting for her. The desert was a place of endless cycles, a place where time and space seemed to bend and twist, where the land could erase you from existence, leaving only whispers and memories behind. The sun was low now, casting long shadows across the barren landscape, and Claire paused to take in the view. The horizon was a blur of sand and sky, the line between them indistinguishable, as though the desert itself had no beginning and no end. She had seen this before, in the stillness of the canyon, in the moments before the fog had consumed her. It was the same feeling, the same pull. The desert was both empty and full, silent and alive. And she was a part of it. She thought of Rachel and Tyler, of their journal entries, their last desperate attempts to understand what they had found. The eye had drawn them in, just as it had drawn Claire, but unlike them, she had survived. She had broken free, or so she thought. The truth, however, was more complex. The desert did not let go. It did not forgive. The whispers came again, louder now, swirling around her like a storm. Claire closed her eyes, the words rising up in her mind. We are all part of it now. We are the desert. The message was clear. The desert had claimed her, just as it had claimed Rachel and Tyler. There was no escape. There never had been. The desert was eternal, and she was a part of it. The wind carried the words, filling her ears with their weight. We are all lost here. We are all part of the cycle. She opened her eyes, and the landscape before her had changed. The rocks seemed to twist, the sand shifting in patterns that were not natural. It was as though the very earth was rearranging itself, moving in response to her presence. Claire stood still, her body frozen in place. The desert had taken her, just as it had taken so many others, but she had uncovered its secret. She had seen the truth. The eye, the force that had drawn them all in, was not just a part of the desert, it was the desert. It was the land itself, its heartbeat, its soul. She could feel it now, the weight of the land in her chest, the pull of the desert deep in her blood. It was a part of her, and she was a part of it. She had been marked, and there was no turning back. There was no escaping the eye. There was no escape from the desert. With a deep breath, Claire took one last step forward, her feet moving through the sand like they had always belonged there. She was no longer fighting it. She had accepted the truth. The desert had claimed her, and now she would walk its endless shifting paths forever. There was no end, no beginning, only the cycle, repeating itself in the land, in the people who were drawn to it. And as Claire disappeared into the desert, her figure swallowed by the vast, endless landscape, the whispers faded into the wind. The desert would never stop calling. It would never stop claiming those who dared to seek its secrets. And as it had claimed Rachel, as it had claimed Tyler, it had claimed Claire. The desert would always be watching, always waiting. And it would never let them go.